So I'm doing that thing that we all love to do with hybrid programs is I pay attention both to you and to the people on the computer. It's fun. I'm Mark Canuel. I'm director of the Institute for the Humanities. Welcome to our space. If you haven't been here before, welcome back. If you have, I'd like, first of all, to alert you to a touch-free, safety-conscious reception that we'll be having after the talk. It's our first time breaking out wine and snacks for whatever it is, 2 years. So I hope that you can join us after the talk for informal conversation. I won't partake because I have a seminar with Bert and he would tell on me if I was like drinking wine. Those of you on Zoom, sadly, will not be able to partake in our dainties after the talk, but next time. We have a few events before today's that I'd like to tell you about, a few in the future that I'd like to tell you about. After today's faculty lecture, or faculty fellow lecture, we have only one more faculty fellow lecture coming up on March 15th, Matthew Kendall's at 4 p.m. at the Institute on the 15th. Again, he will be speaking on Soundworks, Sonic Inscription as Soviet Writing in Mikhail Rom's Oral Stories. So I hope to see all of you back for that. Earlier in the day on March 15th, that's Tuesday of next week, historian Ed Ayers will be joining us here at the Institute from 11 to 1 and on Zoom. He's going to be talking about his work in digital humanities. So I hope that you'll be able to join us on Zoom, or we also have a little bit of space, so talk to me if you would like to join us in person. You can register for this Zoom event by just going to the Digital Humanities Initiative site, which you can access through our website. We'll be relishing our spring break together. I think we all need it. And coming back for a slew of really exciting events in April. On April 4th at 3 p.m., we'll be featuring UIC faculty and another visitor to talk about critical race theory and its place in our national conversation. That's April 4th at 3 p.m. We'll be featuring UIC faculty Joseph Jewell, Anna Guevara, David Stovall, and Terry McMurdy-Chubb from the law school. They'll be joined by Axios Latino reporter Russell Contreras to talk about critical race theory and media. Later on in April, on the 22nd, Sabine Mohammed will be hosting a fabulous workshop on race and urbanization, and our visiting fellow Gerald Horn will be presenting a lecture and seminar on the 26th and 27th, respectively. Horn is one of the foremost scholars in Black studies and the origins of the U.S. Constitution, among other things. These are essential events, and I hope that you'll be joining us. These are on Zoom. You can register for these and everything else by visiting the Institute website, and plus, of course, follow us religiously and fanatically on social media, liking, following, and doing all of the stuff that demonstrates the approval that we so badly need on social media. So do find out more about those events by visiting our website. Now on to today's event, our lecture by Nina Dubin, professor of art history and an affiliate faculty member in French and Francophone studies. She received her BA from Columbia and her PhD from Berkeley before joining us on the UIC faculty in 2006. She is author most recently of Meltdown, Picturing the World's First Bubble Economy, co-written with Meredith Martin and Madeleine Villejuan, co-editor of a special issue on the year 1720, a very important year in the history of modernity. That's a special issue in Journal 18. And she is also author of Futures and Ruins, 18th-century Paris and the Art of Hubert Robert. Anyone who doubts the impact of Robert's paintings would have a change of heart, not only from reading this book, but from observing the influence of Dubin's book on scholars of 18th and 19th century art and the economic contours of aesthetic representation. Its central thesis is that Robert's principal contribution to modern painting is to figure political economic futurity as a site of ruin. And her articles, essays, and reviews broadly ponder the intersection of painting, investment, insurance, speculation, and risk from Fragonard to the present. You may go earlier than Fragonard. It just seems like a great name to mention. Her gallery talks and papers have taken her to universities and galleries throughout the US. And I must say that a gallery tour that she did for a conference that I co-organized just a couple of years ago in my own field was a high point for everyone who participated at that conference. Her fellowships and awards are too numerous to list in their entirety, but they include support from the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., the Getty in Los Angeles, and the Sterling and Francine Clark Institute, where she received the Florence Gould Foundation Fellowship in 2017. The following semester, she was a visiting professor at my alma mater, Williams College, where I'm sure many in EAF had their minds transformed by her work. It's been my great pleasure to have her, our great pleasure, to have her as a colleague this year at the Institute. Please join me in warmly welcoming Nina to speak to us on Eros, Inc., Cupid, Currency, and the Crash of 1720.
Thank you so much for that insanely beautiful, characteristically generous, gorgeously written introduction, Mark Canuel. It's been such a huge gift to be here this year and to have this fellowship, and especially under current world circumstances, it is such a privilege to be in this space. I really want to express my profound gratitude to the Institute for the Humanities, to Mark and to Linda Vavra, and to my fellows here at the Institute, to my colleagues and the students in art history for being such generous and reliable interlocutors for many years now, and to the audience for being here. And it's such a pleasure to see old friends in the room. So thank you all for being here. In the winter of 1799, Napoleon enlisted a camel corps to help advance his Egyptian campaign, adept not only at transporting materiel, but also of sparking terror in the horses of enemy Bedouins. The two-humped creature served for a time as the formidable face of France's doomed effort to colonize Egypt. This anonymous print celebrates the formation of the elite regiment. Like other contemporaneous views of triumphal processions, it declares France the successor of imperial Rome. An example from the preceding summer commemorates another dromedary feat, namely the parade into Paris of antiquities plundered from Italy. Rome is no more in Rome. It is now in Paris, went the song accompanying the march. Our Egyptian landscape references two of the most famous of such Roman marbles. At right, a martialized variation on the Belvedere torso, and at center, the statue known as the Vatican Nile. The river god had counted among the most esteemed of antiquities since its early 16th century excavation in Rome's Campo Marzio. Beatrice's engraving at right transplants to the surrounding frame the vignettes widely admired by early modern antiquarians, carved into the statue's base, where reeds, lotus blossoms, and other examples of Egyptian flora and fauna lined a rocky riverbed, and hippopotami, crocodiles, and bulls interacted with equally exotic beings, the impish imagined denizens of a timeless landscape. Drawing on ancient sources, commentators also understood the sculpture as an allegory of the venerated waters of the Nile, whose annual overflow made possible the country's plentiful harvests. The statue's 16 children symbolize the 16 units of measurement known as cubits, by which the river rose during the rain season, promoting the abundance of wheat, an offering of which the statue holds with his right hand. These cavorting tots, not intact at the time of the sculpture's excavation, were restored in the late 18th century. Similar sculptures, with or without putti, representing the Nile as a recumbent male, crowned by a laurel wreath and bearing a cornucopia, appeared throughout Rome following the annexation of Egypt. Such sculpted personifications of rivers served as metaphors for conquest and were displayed in Roman triumphal processions. Under Octavian, this silver coin, imprinted on its obverse with a crocodile, as well as with the words Egypt captured, glorified the absorption of a territory whose grains would feed Rome's empire. Likewise, the initial success of Napoleon's campaign yielded the bronze medal below, marking the Nile statue as a monument to conquest. The Vatican sculpture would not arrive in Paris until 1803, and the presence in the print of the eagerly awaited war trophy builds expectation not only of its own safe delivery to the French capital, but also of Napoleon's repeat performance in Egypt of military victory. In fact, the Vatican Nile had a long history of being called upon to embody France's imperial ambitions. A copy was produced at the behest of Louis XIV, whose determination to build his kingdom in the image of Rome involved incessant commissions for marble statues. Lorenzo Ottoni's piece was earmarked for the royal gardens of Marly, along with a copy of its presumed pendant, the ancient sculpture of the Tiber. Two additional sculptures of French rivers completed the group. The works suggest and offer a classical precedent for the expansionist appetite of a king who engaged in near constant warfare with rival European powers over the course of 5 decades. On the one hand, then, to excavate France's reception of the Vatican Nile is to revisit its recurrent efforts at empire building, mediated by the memory of Rome. On the other hand, historical cycles of a different sort come to light when we consider the importance of a particular moment in the artwork's afterlife. The moment in question is March 1719, when Ottoni's sculpture was transplanted to the gardens of the Tuileries, where it currently resides. And the cycles I have in mind are the distinctly modern ones of a boom and bust economy. The statue arrived in Paris in the midst of what would henceforth be known as the Mississippi Bubble, so named, as it happens, for yet another river synonymous with the promise of miraculous abundance. More on that point momentarily, as well as on the role of far-flung geographic terrains in catalyzing the world's first international investment bonanza. But first, a word on the power not of place, but rather of time. Ottoni's Nile has seen better days. Its putti were still intact a little more than a century ago, as seen in Aceh's photograph, which records the intact dignity of a subject that it nonetheless eulogizes. Aceh captured the river god at an oblique angle and from below, the better to dramatize the descending line of his body, as well as the equally fatalistic role of the work's casket-like base. Redolent of old Paris, the sculpture functions as a literally fading vestige. A certain strain in art historiography has long pitted sculpture against time, emphasizing the susceptibility to obsolescence of a medium already defined, in the case of bronze and marble casts, by slowness of execution, not to mention a propensity for delayed shipment. Ottoni's sculpture would appear to exemplify the point. Commissioned in 1687 and completed in 1692, the statue, like the Vatican Nile before it, was stranded in transit by disruptions of war. It finally left its Roman storage facility in April 1715, only to reach Marly in August, at which point a dying Louis XIV was presiding over a bankrupt kingdom. Nearly 2.5 decades late to its designated locale, the piece remained at the royal hunting grounds for a mere 4 years before being relocated to the center of Paris. As indicated by the yellow dot, the sculpture's new perch in the Tuileries placed it in proximity both to the Palais Royal, site of the Regency government, and to the neighboring financial epicenter of the kingdom on Rue de Richelieu, soon to headquarter the state's corporate and banking branches. In other words, the sculpture's belatedness and subsequent displacement turned it into a sign of regime change, where Atget saw backward-looking classicism, Parisians 2 centuries earlier, encountering it in a royal park then undergoing renovation, would arguably have perceived the opposite. One can well imagine how the statue, with its illusion of putti on the move, poised to disrupt the stasis of the marble god, would have mirrored a climate of high anticipation. For the regime change marked by the work's relocation was also taking place on the level of medium. 1719 was the year when banknotes became the official currency of state, when tides of paper money flooded the capital, transforming the country's staggering debt into spectacular wealth. If marble statuary comprised the Sun King's medium of choice, the new regime gambled on the magical possibilities of paper, specifically newly issued paper currency backed by the projected profits of New World colonial commerce. Equated with the unprecedented circulation of bills of exchange, stock shares, and other mysterious instruments, the period marked the dawn of what later commentators would describe as the age of paper, or the papered century. Today, as we hardly need reminding, it's largely taken for granted that our current financial system defies sense and therefore representation. Recall that even brokers responsible for buying and selling the collateralized debt obligations that fueled the 2008 meltdown admitted to finding them incomprehensible. It is perhaps for this reason that The Big Short enjoyed such popular success, in that it seemingly demystified the forces that culminated in a global financial crisis. As entertaining as it is, the film hardly begins to answer the question raised around the same time by the historian Jonathan Levy. Noting the dearth of academic studies accounting for the rise of the financial services industry, he asks, how did we end up here? My own research is motivated by the idea that works of art, in their own way, offer a response to this inquiry. One of the significant aspects of the Mississippi bubble is that it marked a moment when the fundamentals of a modern credit economy were imposed upon a public that required persuasion to buy into them. The process of constructing, consolidating, and ultimately enforcing a trust economy involved not only a hegemonic state-sponsored corporation. As the book I'm writing this year argues, artists took on the business of rendering representable, albeit obliquely, the new financial system, of acculturating their audiences to it, even as they vivified its status as a product of artifice and imagination. Broadly speaking, what needed representing circa 1719 was the shift from land-based wealth to an economy of paper signs, or what J.G.A. Pocock has described as the transition from an ancient to a modern conception of property. With the expansion of credit, he writes, property ceased to be real. Instead, it became mobile, imaginary, and speculative. What one owned was promises. In France, this transition was accelerated by John Law, the Scotsman entrusted by the regent with rehabilitating the kingdom's fiscal health. Law's system, as it was called, began with the establishment of the country's first national bank and with the infusion of paper credit into the French economy, first by way of new banknotes that would replace a dwindling coinage supply, and then by way of shares in the Company of the Indies, a state-run conglomerate that oversaw the commercial development of the French colony of Louisiana. Law's system harnessed the capacity of paper to ignite what in today's parlance we call spontaneous optimism. When the economist Robert Shiller invokes the power of a galloping storyline to move markets, he is in fact echoing Law's sentiments. In a 1720 letter, Law instructed the regent that the value of Indy's company stock lay in nothing more substantial than language. Quote, help to back it, speak well of it. You will heighten the confidence of those about you, and that confidence will support the thing itself. The problem eventually with Law's system was that it was all confidence and not a lot in the way of thing. France's bank overprinted paper money, exchangeable for company stock, even as the Louisiana colony underperformed. Yet prior to the crash, confidence did serve as the basis for prosperity. This print captures the crush of the crowd that daily descended on the stock exchange on Rue Quincampoix during the bubble's heyday. The words millionaire and nouveau riche derive from this period, as does the creation of the modern wallet, redesigned to meet the needs of an economy newly defined by the weightlessness of its currency. As one commentator put it, a mere 100 livres in coin was too heavy for a man to carry around, but the same man could have millions in his pocket without noticing the weight. This shift from commodity money to weightless instruments was facilitated by a robust media industry. France's most popular newspaper, the semi-official Nouveau Mercure, equated Law's system with wholesale societal transformation. The arrival of prodigious quantities of circulating paper signaled deliverance from the burdens of mistrust, misery, and the weight of immense debts, wrote the librettist Antoine de la Motte in an ode to the regent. No longer, he continued, was France the war-waging terror of our neighbors. The new administration had ushered in a lighter age, a gentler one, an âge doux. La Motte's ode evidences what the literary historian John O'Brien describes as the mystique of the era's new financial institutions, corporations that would prove far more powerful than the military regimes they superseded. Accordingly, La Motte associates France's conglomerate with the most impenetrable of forces, encouraging the country's continued metamorphosis under Law's system. He concludes by invoking the power of love. As he puts it, quote, let us become the amour of the world. As will be evident to anyone passingly familiar with 18th century French art, La Motte's call was amply heeded. Cupid's subsequent reign over the era's visual culture compelled its most famous fans, Jules and Edmond de Goncourt, writing in 1893, to sum up the entire epic under the paradigm of the flitting and fluttering. Quote, when we lift the veil of the century, we catch a glimpse of a little naked god flying hither and thither. This slide, via a bit of art historical sleight of hand, is meant to suggest the inseparability of the Cupid craze from the expansion of a paper economy. It was not happenstance that the papered century recuperated an ancient pastime of substituting many love gods in place of one. Amours, a favorite subject of print culture, came into currency because they behaved like currency. Their very plurality, the fact that they existed on the level of multiples, were traits that they shared with monetary media. Most crucially of all, as perpetually dynamic beings, they embodied the system's imperative of emphasizing circulation over acquisition, of persuading the public not to hoard its banknotes, but rather to trade them in for stock shares. John Law's backers, in order to suggest the supernatural potential of the new paper money, described it as celestial currency, as instruments whose value depended on their ability to circulate. In turn, amours gained appreciation as significant not for what they meant, but because they moved. Theirs was the power of moving hearts, of animating desire. Moreover, long after the crash, an iconography of love's dangers would immortalize the risks of an overheated market. traces of the bubble would persist in the enduring relationship between Cupid and capital. The widely disseminated image of the bubble-blowing deity takes on the character of currency, and in turn, financial life absorbs convulsions and induces passions normally associated with love. Lamotte's declaration, "Let us become the amour of the world," narrates a paradigm shift, then, from an old regime to a new one. Montesquieu deployed a similar terminology, describing the transition from martial to commercial pursuits as one of virtue giving way to voluptuousness, a term whose root, vol, or flight, forms the basis of a host of evocative descriptors. These include voleur, or thief, volatility, and volage, meaning unfaithful. All traits personified, it so happens, by Cupid, the foe of constancy and the thief of female honor. As a period dictionary noted, Amour's telltale wings enabled him to flutter and flit from one thing to another, to adore everything, and to change like the wind. The scholar Roger Stuverath has scrutinized what he calls the pointless proliferation of putti in ancient Roman art, evidenced in certain variations on the Nile statue. In such cases, he writes, a quantitative impression trumps any sense of allegorical content. I would venture that one of the reasons for the statue's popularity in the 18th century, evidenced in these examples, is that it formally enacted this perceived transition from stability to flightiness, from the primacy of land to the reign of signs unmooring themselves from substance, or what Montesquieu, describing the preponderance of portable assets, called the rise of movable effects. Published the same year that Attoni's sculpture arrived in Paris, Audran's engraving at left circulated in a culture that was increasingly saturated in images of recumbent deities surrounded by putti. And like the Tuileries sculpture, the composition at right trumpets regime change. Its source, a painting by Watteau, dated to the twilight of Louis XIV's reign, when cultural productions of all sorts opposed the empire of Venus, goddess of love, to the king's imperial bloodlust. These included opera ballets authored by Lamotte. In his Triumph of the Arts from 1700, for instance, Venus and Cupid prevail over Apollo, Louis's alter ego, thereby turning the tide on violence, starvation, and poverty. Popular spin-offs followed suit, registering the power of Eros to transcend social difference. Likewise, Prince delivered on the egalitarian promise of Cythera by literally making the mythological island of love accessible to a wide public. Watteau's composition had debts to Francesco Albani's Cupid-strewn allegorical cycles, one of which had recently entered France's royal collection. This one happens to show 16 amours busily making and shooting arrows. At left, alongside Vulcan, a reclining Venus inspects the results of their target practice. At her feet, the standing Cupid shapes a bow with a spoke shave, while the seated one measures it. Their companions at right sharpen arrows on a grindstone and forge arrowheads. In the sky at left, a disapproving Diana, goddess of chastity, prepares to punish Venus and her offspring. Watteau's three archers reprise the roles of the trio who appear in the backgrounds of Albani's painting, which had previously been reproduced by Etienne Baudet and would be re-engraved by Audran following its acquisition by Louis XIV. In a subsequent episode in Albani's series, which narrates the rivalry between the goddess of love and the goddess of chastity, Venus's sleeping progeny are deprived of their weapons by Diana and her nymphs. Though for their part, 18th century French artists would render Diana's victory short-lived, in accordance with Virgil's maxim, omnia vincit amor, love conquers all. Contemporaneous antiquarians touted the same principle. They included Bernard de Montfaucon, whose seminal 15-volume study of antiquity attests to the resurgence of an antiquarian interest in amour, precisely as the bubble was unfolding. Audran, whose engraving of the Nile statue appeared in this publication, also contributed illustrations of the gods' ever-fluctuating guises, shown variously in infancy and adolescence, jumping, dancing, playing in the air, on the ground, and so on. The deity, wrote the author, performed an endless repertoire of roles. Like the ancients before him, Montfaucon emphasized the instability and flightiness of a god whose resistance to being pinned down also manifested itself in the fact that he had not one name but two, Cupidon and Amour, both designating the personification of amorous desire. Beyond the idiosyncrasy of his appellation lay the mystery of his genealogy. Nothing is equal to the obscurity of the origins of Cupid, wrote Montfaucon, noting that while Venus was commonly accepted as the god's mother, no consensus had ever existed concerning the identity of his father. Lamotte's provocation, "Let us become the amour of the world," thus coincided with a renewed appreciation of the sovereignty perversely possessed by the smallest of gods. For Montfaucon, writing like Lamotte in 1719, Cupid's empire over all things derived from his mutability, malleability, and versatility, precisely the traits that served as the hallmarks of the new joint stock companies driving that year's investment mania. It was also in 1719 that the inscrutable Indies Company not only renamed itself, having formerly been the Company of the West, but also grew into a behemoth, solidifying its own empire over the so-called four corners of the world by absorbing the entirety of France's overseas corporate activities. When antiquarians suggested that Cupid's power derived from the fact that he had no essence, that he existed as volatility incarnate, they also offered a formula for making sense of a marketplace dominated by ever-mutating corporate entities and by the endlessly fluctuating share values that kept speculators buying and selling from day to night. For friends of the new regime, the triumph of love was the triumph of the stock market. As the bubble progressed, no shortage of descriptions of the booming economy likened Paris to Cythera. Lamotte's invocation of amour appeared in the Nouveau Mercure alongside a poem visualizing the Seine lined with winged rowers bearing quivers as well as oars. Another item addressed stock traders as lovers who lured one another with financial papers that were themselves playfully dubbed billets doux, or love letters. A popular song proclaimed that even Cupid had sold his arrows to become a share trader. The potential of the stock exchange to spread wealth promoted urban legends of lackeys transformed into millionaires, much as Cythera encouraged class mixing. As one comedy put it, quote, "Everyone makes a pilgrimage to the temple of the son of Venus. The court, the town, the village are equally received there." Amorous pilgrimages also served as euphemisms for colonial expansion. It was likely at the behest of Indies Company backers that Francois Gérard Jolin produced this poster-sized advertisement of New Orleans as a tropical paradise replete with fertile pastures, mountains of gold, and childlike natives eager to trade precious metals for European trinkets. The print, clearly designed to recruit settlers to the fledgling colony, shows French arrivals at a bustling port drinking wine with their indigenous counterparts and converting them to Christianity at left. At right, a pile of game, along with the arrival of a woman bearing textiles, allude to warm commercial relations between the two groups. The lengthy text below describes an Eden on the banks of the Mississippi. The reference in the title to the Indians of Mexico implicitly reactivates Spanish conquest-era visions of unimaginable wealth. In reality, the underpopulated colony was an unprofitable swamp, reliant for sustenance on shipments from France. Charlotte Guichard has suggested that Jolin's print, with its fantastical mountains and intertwined bodies, has debts to Watteau's embarkation to Cythera, a work that the painter submitted to the Academy in 1717, the same week that John Law's company obtained its monopoly on trade with Louisiana. In their efforts to woo the indigenous, Jolin's pilgrims assumed the role of Watteau's male seducers. Viewers of Jolin's print would have been primed to understand his depiction of trade through the lens of courtship. It bears underscoring that the French term commerce, which appears in the engraving's title, had long denoted conversation and other polite forms of social intercourse, frequently between the sexes. Commerce took on the task of sublimation in ways registered in Jolin's print. At the time of its publication, accounts of Louisiana described it as a place of emancipatory possibility, and more specifically of sexual liberation. Indigenous women were rumored to be both free of inhibition and available to Frenchmen as concubines. Such reports noted the existence of medicinal plants known to induce abortion, thus promoting an image of Louisiana as a site of erotic as well as economic adventure. In recalling Watteau's Cythera, Jolin's print also ran the risk of reminding viewers of the darker elements of a painting that has historically been interpreted as allegorizing the transience of human happiness. On this score, what is in part remarkable about the engraving is the paucity of actual goods on display. The print's unvisualized promise of riches is described in the description below, which hints at wealth that exists only on paper. Jolin's depiction of commerce is more accurately a portrayal of faith. The text concludes with an account of the progress of missionaries in winning the indigenous population over to Catholicism, as illustrated by the profession of belief expressed by the woman at left. An image of commercial exchange thus culminates in one of religious credence. As such, it also encapsulates a system that sought to convert not only gold into paper, paper into money, and money into stock shares, but more generally, a skeptical populace into a trusting one. The print's indoctrinated subjects implicitly include the French as well, a people forcibly compelled to place its confidence in the mystical workings of credit. In implicitly invoking Cythera, the engraving also tells us something about the ways in which finance was understood through the lens of amorous exchange. Love, not only as an age-old catalyst of irrational exuberance, but also as a domain of the ethereal and the fleeting, served as a touchstone for a culture navigating the potentially insubstantial and imaginary opportunities of a speculative marketplace. There exist historic grounds for relating the risks of romance to the opaque financial operations of a colonizing power. As Mary Sheriff has discussed, Watteau's embarkation to Cythera coincided with the forced emigration of prostitutes and other unfortunate women to Louisiana. This engraving, after a now lost painting by Watteau, shows such female undesirables preparing for transit to the Ile Dauphine in Mobile. Such deportations began when the company charged with developing the colony was still operated by Antoine Crozat, brother to one of Watteau's most significant patrons. Between 1717 and 1720, more than 1,400 men and women were shipped to Louisiana by a government anxious to grow its colony while ensuring its racial purity. Watteau's exiles include the pregnant woman at center, whose trusting expression both explains her condition and spells misfortune at the hands of the insincerely gallant man before her. The composition serves, in a sense, as a caricature of his earlier embarkation to Cythera, and the same might be said of accounts of the deportations to Louisiana. In September 1719, Perhaps around the time that Watteau produced the lost work, the chronicler Jean Bouvard reported that some 180 French girls had been forcibly wedded to criminals and other abductees in a Paris church, and that following their nuptials, the newly declared husbands and wives had been chained to one another and delivered to vessels bound for the Mississippi, escorted along the way by 20 archers. The description is remarkable on several counts. Among them, its implicit placement of state agents in the position of arrow-toting amours. Bouvard's horrified communique presages the growing indistinction between, on the one hand, female ingenues tricked into disrepute and shipped to Louisiana, and on the other, French settlers seduced by illusions of free love and easy money into going there voluntarily. Within a matter of months, the outrage triggered by forced migrations became inseparable from the insurrection of a populace that had been forced by the state's devaluing of gold and silver to place its trust in the worth of fiduciary paper. The merger of the Indies Company and the Royal Bank, that is, of a mysterious colonial enterprise and an equally opaque financial system, meant that it was only a matter of time before mass panic would ensue. The print at Bright dismantles the mythologized symbiosis of free love and a free market. Likewise, reports of chained newlyweds carted through the streets of Paris challenged an official image of the French capital as a happy Cythera. The new regime of amour more accurately marked the enactment by an absolutist state of Cupid's tyrannical powers. News of forced transit implicitly reveals another difference that existed between the new regime and the previous one. 3 months earlier, in June 1719, the first ship carrying enslaved West Africans had arrived in Louisiana following the absorption by the Indies Company of the French slave trade. As Meredith Martin and Gillian Weiss have shown, Louis XIV had staged his sovereignty over the Mediterranean by making a spectacle of enslavement, specifically of Muslim, Ottoman, and Moroccan subjects forced into galley servitude. As exemplified in this drawing of a royal naval craft, gilded sculptures of manacled bodies attested to the monarch's might by portraying his power to condemn prisoners to the oar. So too does this aerial view of a galley with enslaved rowers chained to their benches. With the change in regime, enslavements and conquest were pointedly overwritten by the image of Cythera. Pellegrini's mural, painted on the ceiling of France's Royal Bank, is no longer extant, save for this sketch. But we know from descriptions that its portrayal of arriving vessels loaded with goods from Louisiana references the same amorous imagery familiar from Watteau, whose second version of Cythera is shown here. At the bottom left of Pellegrini's sketch, the river gods of the Mississippi and the Seine embrace, staging yet again the sexualization of commerce. A reclining river god appears as well in Francois Lemoine's rival proposal for the bank's ceiling, which similarly portrays a portside reunion of personifications, including France, shown honoring Neptune while receiving goods from far-flung ports. As in Watteau's painting, amours swarm the skies. Love emblems had long compared Cupid's desire-activating powers to the animating force of wind. Accordingly, in Lemoine's sketch, winged putti meaningfully generate the winds that enable transatlantic commerce, just as in Watteau's painting, they ignite the passion that transports lovers to Cythera. The erasure of enslavement from state-sponsored propaganda accompanied the change in regime, not only from the Sun King to the Regent, but also from Apollo to Amor, and from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. Warships gave way to a merchant fleet. Chained rowers were superseded by free-floating putti. Unlike reports of French subjects abducted by the state and deported to Louisiana, the colony's reliance on the labor of enslaved Africans provoked scant outrage. But it is useful to consider that the marshaling of the myth of Cythera was also designed to repress awareness of precisely such facts. For one thing, the very concept of labor, of effort exerted, was stricken from accounts of Louisiana, described by a typical source as an enchanted land where every seed one sows multiplies 100-fold. More fundamentally, the emergence of winged amours as harbingers of capital flow coincided with the forced deracination of human subjects. Under the sign of Cythera, mobility could be mythologized as liberatory as opposed to coercive. Such a context helps elucidate the sinister quality of this work, painted by another propagandist for John Law's system, Charles Coipel. It shows 5 amours laboring in a forge. Arrows are sequentially hammered and heated at center, stolen by a satyr at right, deployed on a love interest at bottom left, placed in a quiver by the amour at left, and raised in the air by the gloating Cupid above, whose triumphalism makes political sense. Amour had prevailed under the regent, to whom the painting belonged. It hung in the Palais Royal, in the bedroom of the Duke's young son. Around the same time that he completed the painting, Coipel, who was also a playwright, authored a ballet celebrating the imminent ascendancy of a new monarch whose reign promised to enthrone the virtues of love and prosperity. The young Louis XV himself even danced the part of Cupid, enacting the ascendancy of Eros. Coipel promoted the new regime in still other ways. In 1719, he penned an ode to John Law, which appeared in the Nouveau Mercure alongside the one La Motte had written to the regent. The painter compared Indy's company stock shares to the 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish with which Christ had fed the multitudes. Coipel addressed John Law not only as the Son of God, having presided over a dazzling miracle, but also as a modern-day Joseph, an outsider who had brought abundance to a sterile Egypt, much as the Scotsman had delivered salvation to France. And Rafi, if there's a Yiddish joke that you can tell to that, effect, I'd be excited. It is notable that Coipel happened to reside near the Tuileries in an apartment within the Palais du Louvre. His encomium, recalling the precedent of Egyptian bounty, was published a month after the appearance, virtually in his backyard, of the Nile statue. Another visual reference point for the artist was this work. Coipel's Cupids hammering arrows on an anvil borrows from Albani's allegory of the elements of fire, which shows Jupiter at center, desired by the love-struck mortal Semele in the far right. Vulcan appears at left, and above, Venus rides a chariot, spreading love's flames with her torches, ensuring the triumph of Cythera. Mission accomplished, proclaims Coipel's painting at right. No longer are these amours laboring under the eye of Vulcan, the original fashioner of Cupid's arrows, nor do they serve at the pleasure of scheming Olympians. Employed as picturesque accessories in Albani's landscapes, in Coipel's adaptation, the amours usurp the leading role, literally coming into their own. In place of the scattered activity of the work at left, the one at right substitutes an uninterrupted and thus inescapable circuit. Even the defiant satyr, shown making off with Cupid's arrows, underscores the love god's undisputed power. The engraving after the picture makes this clear. According to the print's lettering, though the satyr believes himself to be wickedly stealing Amour's weapons, his action is in fact observed with approval by the all-seeing deity who welcomes the itinerancy of love's arrows. Coipel's ode to a triumphant Amour may well have been produced around the time of his ode to John Law and the two reward comparison. The artist hailed the financial wizard for his ability to multiply miracles. Similarly, Coipel equates Cupid's might with his capacity to multiply, a power replicated in the proliferation and circulation of his weapons. Like the engraver's burin or the etcher's needle, the arrows of amour are vested with the potential for reproduction. The use of the phallic implement at lower left as a catalyst for sexual awakening exemplifies this potential, as does the rapacious satyr. In describing the satyr as a voleur, a thief, the prince calls attention to Cupid's embodiment of that same status, not only as a robber of women's virtue, but also in this instance as a renegade who has overtaken the forge of Vulcan, the god of alchemy. In portraying Cupid's mastery over the alchemical production of magical arrows, Coipel's composition evokes the kinship between the alchemy of love and the alchemy of finance. No less than the print at left, what the work at right conjures ultimately is the triumph of an airtight system from which not even a deviant satyr can stray. Law's system was understood in similar terms, as the product of a mysterious, foolproof alchemy, a divine formula for wealth production, as encapsulated by the cornucopias at the foot of the print at left, which spill forth gold and stock shares alike. Nor is the erotic encounter unfolding in the foreground of Rue Quincampoix, where a man caresses a woman's cheek while she extends a hand into his pocket, the only point of similarity between these two works. Coipel's subject recalls a favorite maxim coined by La Rochefoucauld, quote, "There is only one kind of love, but there are 1,000 different copies," unquote. That is, unlike the rampancy of foolish desire, true love proves elusive. Coipel's interchangeable cupids suggest the motto's applicability to the stock market. As near copies of one another, his amours model a paradigm of herd behavior, of mimicry and imitation, precisely the comportments that drive a speculative bubble, as Rachel Weber beautifully discussed in her recent Institute lecture. Similarly, in the view at left, as Katie Scott has noted, the principle of uniformity extends well beyond the barely differentiated members of a mob, encompassing the serialized repetition of inlaid bricks, window panes, and cobblestones. On the heels of the crash, the shared valencies of these two prints would have been evident. Long after the bank runs and Law's flight from Paris, accounts of the regent's financial crimes also relayed his sexual transgressions. The indiscriminate flow of banknotes and stock shares had leveled the social hierarchy. Charges that the regent had violated the natural order by imposing mass sameness in place of carefully calibrated class differences resounded in rumors of court incest and debauchery. Palace orgies were said to involve royals and servants alike. According to one supposed witness of such collective depravity, quote, "The ranks confused were in perfect equality." Numerous Dutch caricatures that lampooned the bubble feature scenes of unprecedented social mixing. This one turns the iconic French image of the triumphal procession on its head. It shows John Law in the guise of a fool vomiting stock shares, while the devil injects him with gas, wind being a metaphor for the speculation in vaporous commodities. In the sky above, Mercury, the god of commerce, urges Jupiter to punish the stock trading mob for having deviated from the path of honorable trade. Mercury assumes the role played by the offended Diana in Albani's composition, turning the army of amours below into an analog of the speculating crowd. The analogy is fitting, for the print at right appeared in a publication that explicitly likens the French bubble to an episode of mass heartbreak. Its frontispiece borrows from an emblem of courtship. It shows John Law kneeling before a sorceress, inviting her to lend his scheme her powers of bewitchment. Above, two amours enact love's blinding effects. Such prints periodically confirm that France had become the amour of the world, a thief of wealth, virtue, reason, and societal decorum alike. Cupid and John Law appear in such caricatures as tyrannical sidekicks. Such works invite us to consider yet another reason why Albani's composition may have appealed to a supporter like Coipel of Law's system. Venus's abundant offspring are as much a sign of the aging Vulcan's lack of paternal claim as they are a tribute to her reproductive and adulterous capacities. Similar associations were arguably activated by Law's system. The first generation of stock shares Law issued were known as mères, or mothers, and those subsequently issued were nicknamed filles and petites filles, daughters and granddaughters. The terminology marks a cultural tendency to personify inscrutable market forces as female. Yet to ascribe a non-paternalistic genealogy to stock shares, thereby endowing them with connotations of promiscuity, was also to undermine the sanctity of bloodlines, a concept central to the traditional landed nobility who saw in the system an existential threat. A similar tension reveals itself in Albani's picture. At the corner of Venus's bed is an Ephesian fertility idol. The sculpture symbolizes the inexhaustible reproductive capacities not only of Venus, but also of nature itself, evidenced in the pastoral landscape that comprises Albani's primary subjects. Early modern accounts of the picture emphasized the artist's reproductive gifts as well, tracing Albani's absorption in the putti theme to the fact of his having fathered some 12 children. Yet it is also the case that the painting captivated a bubble-era culture preoccupied with the risks of confusing actual bounty with excessively available signs of it. If the canvas invites viewers to cast an admiring gaze both on the voluptuous Venus and on the sprawling beauty of the surrounding landscape, it also compels us to view such a spectacle from the perspective of the uneasy Diana. This inseparability of admiration and unease is concentrated in the fertility symbol. Notice how its rounded contours rhyme with those of the archer's bows, arrayed serpent-like on the ground by the foot of the standing amour. For good reason, what Stuvera quoted earlier, described as the pointless proliferation of putti in Roman art, made a comeback in a culture newly aware of the capacity of excess to trigger hyperinflation, of the signs of copiousness to devolve into endless, worthless copies. In the aftermath of the crash, a robust trade in printed ornaments recalled for critics the dangerous commerce in sterile paper instruments. Commentators inveighed against the proliferation of seductive designs described as all the more dangerous for being easily imitated. This engraving, after a sealing by Watteau, extends a long-standing tradition of deploying putti as signs of the reproductive capacities of print itself. A 1731 advertisement of the work announced the sale of infinitely ingenious ornaments that would appeal not only to collectors, but also to artisans of all sorts, including painters, fan makers, sculptors, goldsmiths, tapestry makers, and embroiderers. in promoting the design's multimedia adaptability, and such marketing heralded the potential for weightless paper to yield luxury objects, and thus to contribute to what was known even then as the real economy. Critics of an abundantly generative ornament trade, however, perceived the opposite. One writer described an excess upon excess of paper, the sheer quantity of which precluded conversion into anything of real value. Watteau's composition hints at Cupid's suitability as the face of a paper order taking leave of a real economy, just as prints float free from an inscribed plate. Historians of print tell us that Venus was associated with the element of copper, the material support of engraving. Cupid's arrows afforded printmakers an emblem of their own artistry in ways rehearsed by Watteau's design. It shows Cupid wounding Venus with his weapon, precisely the act recounted by Ovid that would cause her to fall in love with the mortal Adonis, a follower of Diana, thereby sparking the rivalry portrayed in Albani's cycle. Beneath the central vignette of Watteau's composition, winged putti, suspended by delicate tendrils, seem poised to join the flight of the nearby doves. As a ceiling design, the print registers the antithesis between the earthbound and the skybound, at a time when the constancy of land was still contrasted to the volatility and aerial capacities of paper currency. For reasons I have endeavored to make clear, the rise of Cupid as emperor of the ethereal equally pertained to the ascendancy of high finance. All right, final paragraph. According to historians, today's bubble-prone economy has roots in the long 18th century. What I want to suggest in closing is that the age's accompanying cultural practices have had a similarly consequential afterlife. Reports that cryptocurrency scammers have targeted dating apps, defrauding credulous women of their savings, read like sequels to 18th century epistolary novels. Similarly, Damien Hirst's grotesque display of a skeletal Cupid fashioned from gold, silver, and bronze seems every bit as parodic as the Dutch bubble caricatures of 1720. Hirst produced 3 such sculptures in 2008, a year synonymous with global financial crisis, turning the piece into a macabre memento mori. A mortal Cupid, depleted of his airborne powers, allegorizes the crash of financial markets, though in their own perverse way, Hirst's sculptures, weighed down by precious metals, also anticipate the soaring comeback of the price of gold, which, like that of all other commodities in 2008, had plummeted. Even in death, Cupid channels market volatility, suggesting the still triumphant reign of a little naked god flying hither and thither. Thank you.
Really lovely talk, and really love the analysis of some of these meetings.
Thank you.
I guess I'm wondering about Haiti.
About Haiti, yes.
So essentially, I want to know, like, what's the aftermath of the bubble bursting?
Yeah.
And if Haiti sort of sold in similar ways to investors? Is there kind of mechanisms to guard against massive financial speculation? Like, what changes in the kind of aftermath of Mississippi bubble?
There's actually a really great historian at MIT who's written about this, Malik Gatcham. And I mean, he makes the point that even though the Haitian Revolution doesn't, obviously happen until the end of the century, that the roots for the political insurrection are sowed kind of at this moment, that it's a moment of corporate power, and it's corporations who are very much active in these, sugar islands. And that the sort of opacity of kind of corporate culture, I mean, according to him, is kind of actually part of the prominent like sort of triggers for a lot of the revolt. And in fact, it wasn't actually just kind of the enslaved who rose up, but it was also actually French, like, you know, Europeans who moved to Haiti and felt as if they also kind of couldn't trust the corporate system. But I mean, I think there's more to your, I mean, I think, you know, certainly there are ways in which what was happening elsewhere in the Antilles are being mapped onto Louisiana and kind of vice versa. I mean, there are like, I think 2 points to be made here are probably that, you know, the Code Noir is which was already used in the Antilles, which is a way to regulate relations actually between Black and white subjects, is adapted for Louisiana. But it's also the fact that the Louisiana colony was just never very profitable, and that Haiti and these other islands were in fact enormously profitable. Mark?
Thank you so much for this fantastic talk. I was wondering if you should talk a little bit about genre. I mean, you expose so much in these readings of the artworks, and you make connections that are surprising and intriguing. And I was wondering if you have found much in poetry or novels that exploits overtly the connections that you're making and where one might turn to find that.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So I think that a lot of what I'm interested in is very much being articulated in epistolary novels. So I don't know that I have a huge amount to say about that in the chapter that this material is reflecting, but I have a second chapter which is really about love letter paintings and in relation to epistolary novels. So I mean, I briefly kind of showed the Fragonard painting that's on the cover of a recent edition of Dangerous Liaisons, which is, I think, a really apropos example. But there are also all kinds of, I mean, I'm really pretty much focusing on the French version of this, I should say, like as a kind of apology to my British focused friends. But in any sense, there really is a way in which I think I have found wonderful evidence, I think, in both genres of literature and occasional prints, that a lot of the what we talk about when we call it the papered century or the age of paper. I mean, one of the things I like about that concept is that it really does blur the differences between all these different genres. So I think that we can think about that phrase in relation to the abundance of fiction, of novels that were being read, which were actually considered to be as problematic as paper money was, that they threatened to kind of corrupt women, that they were, reading was a dangerous pastime, especially reading these novels. And that there's a way in which that phrase, the papered century, so it's invoking both literature and art, print culture, in addition to monetary instruments. And I think that those very blurrings really do get represented in a lot of these cultural examples. Danny?
First, thank you so much for this robust presentation. And I'm so grateful that I was attending probably 7 years ago, one of your first presentations on this topic, and then took a class that addressed.
I don't know if it was 7 years ago, was it? Ugh.
No, well, that's not to say it's taking forever to finish this, but it's also saying, what it's actually saying is how much time and energy you put towards this, and to contrast those two presentations to this one, how fat this one is with information and analysis is quite marvelous to experience.
Thank you.
And it leads to far too many questions that would not lead me to go into a tangent, but I do have some notes on the question I have. So, and I'll also say so many questions that are centered within the construction of race and also gender out of this papered society, and the privileging of a certain form of humanity that's disseminated through a certain image. a white image, one of a classical image, European, most like Greco-Roman image as well. So I'm thinking about Cupid and amours. And it seemed like some of the images of the amours were with wings, and then there's some that seem to not have wings, or at least if they had wings, they were not visible, which kind of makes you, if you're looking at it first glance, okay, those could be humans, or these around them could be these immortal beings, but they're all depicted as these deities. But I think the tension between what's a deity and what's not within the same composition by something that can just be a wing in that decision. These are artists who are deciding or positioning a body so that the wing isn't seen or could be assumed there, or and you can just assume it's there, but it's still not seen, which puts the viewer in a position of seeing themselves as a human within this. And then, of course, who gets to have access to that form of visualized humanity? It's such an iconic image that is also leading an economic time in an entire phase. So with that, we saw the wings, I'm sorry, not the wings, but the weapons disappear after Venus's and Diana's feudal relationship. It comes and then it returns again. And I was thinking of these wings also that show up very prominently with the ceiling rendering for Watteau's 1731 design that you showed up. So the weapon appears again and the wings. So that idea goes into this, this fear of, the dangers of fiscal involvement and, the volatility of it and then the fleetingness of it. But then it also roots itself in this kind of grounded human desire when we see these deities without wings, and it happens so fast, I don't think you even realize. But if you go through your myriad of images, you'll see there's times when just the wings are not visible, and what that does. And I'm hoping that's something that you'll tease out even more specifically with this, because I think there's something there that's quite fruitful with your discussion. So I don't think I had a question at all. Sorry.
Well, no, I mean that's a extremely important observation. So it is you're totally right that sometimes actually all these kuti who are appearing throughout all of these examples are constantly eluding any kind of stable category. Sometimes there's a way in which that is playfully kind of staged. So you'll have a Cupid whose wings are sort of being a little bit disguised, but still somewhat visible. And so there are ways in which the indeterminacy of is this a Cupid or is it actually just like a little mischievous child is being intentionally played with. And I think that part of what I'm arguing and kind of the fuller version of this is that, and you see this a lot in like Boucher also, where he has like multiple putti within like a sculptural frieze that he's painting. And he also has, say, like a love letter, women looking at a love letter. And this creates all kinds of questions and uncertainties about, are these, the very nature of the fact that it's not clear if these are Cupids or if they're just, there's the generic term enfant ends up being used a lot, which I think it just means children, but it also kind of stands in for, we don't know how to categorize these creatures. And I think that, I trace the same sort of ambiguity and kind of indeterminacy in the ways in which paper itself gets portrayed in a lot of the paintings that I end up talking about in a later chapter, where not only are there multiple letters, but it's not clear who the author is, who the recipient is, who is that third person who's like looking at this whole exchange, and then also are these even meant for anybody who's actually so there are all kinds of questions about identity. But one thing that your question, I think, makes me want to just make explicit, going back to the earlier part of your comment, is that at the very moment when I think there is a fetishization of the indeterminacy, both of these little deities and also of media of exchange, there's also an absolute effort to very strictly categorize on racial lines. So that's something that
really well, I think. Yeah, that part I really got. But when we're talking about this kind of precariousness that's associated with both Eros and financial stability, which I think we all witnessed that firsthand with the onset of the pandemic. So, and then it's kind of third eye watching, which can be this almost a theological conversation or something, or a metaphysical conversation of what's controlling all of this. Because you can plan, you can have everything in stock, you can save and do everything you're supposed to do. Also, you can date for 2 years, trust this person, believe in everything they say, and they're not at all who you thought they were to be. So I think your conversation is really about how, I mean, I don't know if it's a hopeful or a pessimistic idea of just how doubtful and dubious the veracity of any of these entities is and continues to be in present day. With all of this wonderful research and all that we've lived through experientially, none of us knows anything more than we ever did in 16 to 18 to 2022. You know, so I find that actually very fascinating as well with this.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, this is so rich and exciting and so wonderful to think with. You know, the images are going to stay with me for a while. I actually just really wanted to come back to the Nile sculpture at the beginning, because obviously I think it's a really wonderful move to kind of shift from sculpture to paper and from, you know, epic and empire on the one hand to kind of Eros and finance. But I just was wondering if you could kind of give us the bottom line of how you're reading it, because I initially thought, oh, this is a contrast between two modes, but then actually no, it's really a reading of this sculpture is implicated in the finance mode because of the Cupid. And then I started thinking, well, in some ways these two modes like go all the way back. You know, even in Augustan Rome, there's this, you know, intense anxiety about Egypt as a feminized space in which actually the kind of feminized economic life is going to overcome the martial virtue, you know, and you get somebody like Antony, who's sort of like dangerous precisely as like the Roman guy who goes and kind of gets too into the luxury products and too into these trade relationships and, you know, et cetera. So that was one thing I started thinking of. But then I guess the question I'm wondering about on the kind of bottom line level is this guy like a figure for, in the end, kind of French Empire, which is being remade in a kind of form that is, you know, feminized, and he has the kind of same, you know, recumbent position of a Cytherea or something like that? Or is it that is there a kind of racial thing going on in which he's a kind of figure of like Egypt as a place of labor and production, and the Putti are kind of these like speculative, you know, white figures, sort of, so to speak, almost like preying on him, you know? So but we're just like on a sort of very basic level. I guess I'm wondering, like at the end of the paper, when we go back to the, you know, 1688 piece, like what is that piece, you know?
Yeah, you mean the Atoni?
Yeah, the Atoni.
So yeah, that's a really great astute observation. You know, I was, the last time I was in Paris, I was like walking in the Tuileries, and I like happened upon, you know, this thing which I'd walked past hundreds of times, but like I just happened to notice the plaque and made note of the date. And I thought, well, this seems really important for my purposes, you know, that it arrived when it did, because I think there is something extremely important about the form. And I think I'm hesitant to speak to allegorical meaning of it, because one of the things I love about this piece right now is the idea that it won't be kind of stabilized, or, you know, it won't be kind of, it won't conform to any kind of interpretation that one would place on. I mean, I like the idea that it remains sort of generative of different unstable possible readings, but it's the kind of form of it, of like that this Nile is ultimately an allegory of a geographic body of water. I mean, it's absolutely rooted in a place, and it's generating all of these portable copies. And in its own way, it's actually already internalizing that logic, because it is this God reclining with 16 little tots jumping all over him and looking as if they're about to kind of take off. And so this was, what you're picking up on by asking me this question, I think, is kind of like, why did I frame the paper with this sculpture? And I did it as kind of as an experiment. I wanted to know, like, how would writing about this make it more clear to me? And I think ultimately, my own view of things is that, and this is partly like a Susan Buckmore's throwaway line that I came across, in which she says that, it's in the 18th century that the economy, first comes into existence as an autonomous category, and that it also comes into existence by virtue of being represented. Like, it can only exist if it gets represented. And I think part of what I'm interested in is the ways in which, even inadvertently, a copy of an ancient sculpture, I'm not saying it was placed there in order to represent anything, but I am saying that it somehow helps give form to a change. And that change is from, it was important for people to believe that they were living through something different that was akin to Joseph bringing affluence to sterile Egypt. I think that was a very resonant message, because France had recovered from, like half a century of war, famine, even this thing called the Little Ice Age, where, there was no food. So starvation, poverty, debt, and bloodshed, it was bad, and this was an age that was promising, that actually delivered abundance. And I think that finding ways in which that got mirrored, whether accidentally or not, in culture, I think is really playing a very important role in helping solidify that process whereby a new regime really does supersede an old regime.
We have a question from Blake online, so I'm going to see if we can get his voice.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Is this, okay. Thank you, Nina. Talk attempted to quip that I love talks about sex and I love talks about money, and in this one we got both, so it's a nice twofer. I have a two-part question. The first part is trying to tease out a distinction that I think is part of what you're saying, but I'm not completely sure. And then the second part is to try to apply that distinction to the present, to the sort of post-2008 moment. So the distinction is between two kinds of instability or forgetting the word you use, but just sort of protean mobile meaning. The first one tied to colonials is a kind of geographic instability, an expansion of boundaries, not sure where the boundaries of your world exists, moving out into a larger world. Second one is the sort of instability that gets introduced by a debt-based, credit-based economy with paper money. And of course, those two notions of instability would be, to put them into Marxist terms, would be the distinction between primitive accumulation, which would be associated with colonialism, and then capitalist productivity, which would be associated with the emergence of a market-based system, and of course a debt or credit economy enables that. So the question is, what's the relationship between those two parts? If we allow them to be separate, both reflective of the general cultural or historical tendency describing, but nonetheless, separately representative of that. And then the second part of the question, having to do with the present, is to try to think about them in relationship to two recent phenomena. One is MMT, or modern monetary theory, and the second one being NFTs, or crypto more largely. And of course, both MMT and NFTs we think of as being something completely, without any concrete attributes, right? That it is, you're just printing money. You have no idea where it comes from with MMT, and with NFTs, of course, what is it? It's this flitting piece of code. And so my question then is there a way to make a critical distinction between the two sides, both in the historical period and in the contemporary period, with the critical distinction being something like, MMT and the production of a credit-based economy, both in the end are regulated by the state. And the state is what allows them to be productive, as it limits them in different ways. Whereas NFTs, escape the boundaries of the state. And of course, colonialism, part of the appeal of it, escapes the boundary of the state. And then if I could just tack on one more thing tied to the sexuality part of the talk and say that, on some level, it seems like there's a strong distinction between the sexuality of the colonies and the sexuality of the financialized or credit-based market economy. And so one pictorial distinction is the distinction that you highlighted between the idea of the archer on the one hand, which is a military figure, and the idea of the putti or the Cupid, which doesn't have that same kind of military association. And so this in the end might be a distinction between, on the level of erotics, a distinction between something like a productive or generative love, right? And a exploitative, violent, taking of sexuality. So does that make sense?
Yeah, can you repeat that? I'm just kidding. All right. So I think I'm not. Let's see. Where should I? Okay, I'll just start. Maybe I'll start.
Yes, I'm happy. I am happy to repeat.
I'll start with like the third part of the question, which had to do with. Well, maybe I'll do the first one. I mean, just to sort of like give a very simple answer to the first part, which had to do with the relationship between geographical expansion and a debt-based economy. I mean, there's a lot that's been written about that. That's been, that's like, I mean, I think of somebody like, what's his name, like Jean-Joseph Gou, who's, who sort of very wonderfully talks about how in any kind of productive economy, you have to have the right kinds of balance between desire and fulfillment, and he means that both economically and romantically, that it's, and that if, you can't, these two things have to remain in productive tension with one another. And I think that, in the case of law system, he very much, I think the sort of consensus right now is that he himself didn't necessarily believe that the financial system even needed to be backed up by the colonial one. So land didn't have to be the basis for money, but this was something that needed to be insisted upon in order to get people to, in a land-based kind of state, to buy into the value of these debt notes. So, I mean, and I just want to also mention that relationship hasn't been fully worked out in the historiography. I mean, this story that I'm telling about the Mississippi bubble has really been historically dominated by kind of neoliberal economic historians who talk about it as the increasing, this triumphant story of the increasing abstraction of monetary instruments. And there's really no kind of discussion actually of the colonial implications of it. And especially as an art historian, because this stuff doesn't tend to get represented, it's sort of, it's a challenge, to try to figure out, how do I tell this story of colonialism by way of works of art that don't necessarily vivify it for us? I mean, you have to kind of creatively seek it out. So I think you had asked a question about the MMTs and the NFTs, which I think was the second part of your question. And I would say that, obviously, Law's vision ultimately gets realized. So we live in a world in which, and this was part of the interest for me about, I think kind of the argument that I'm trying to make ultimately is all of us live in this system that we don't understand and we're forced to trust in, because there really is no escaping it. Like, there is no escape. I mean, we're all, the satyr in that painting by Claude, we're all, pretending that somehow we can maybe live outside the system, but we can't. Like, you can't not have like Apple Pay or whatever. I mean, you can't not like have access to all of these dematerialized currencies. So they're really, and I sort of, for me, this whole part of the interest to me of this material is that it's letting us understand the origins of this history in which this was a moment when people were self-consciously thinking like, oh my God, like I'm trusting in this bizarre new economy. And then they realized that actually they shouldn't have trusted in it. And then ironically, they end up trusting in it anyway. And that's because even though banknotes get demonetized, letters of credit become the prime medium of exchange. So the paper economy remains very much alive and well. And this is, I think, what historians mean when they trace our current system to the age of paper. And I mean, the thing about NFTs, and I sort of in another version of this kind of made the point that those Hearst, Cupid's lie sculpture is also in its own way kind of allegorizing the birth of cryptocurrency, because it's obviously 2008 is the moment when everyone loses trust in the state and in the state's ability to regulate its money. And so NFTs or cryptocurrency is born out of that state of distrust. So I don't know that I have a ton more to say about how, about the difference between MMT and NFT in relation to, but I, maybe you and I need to have a sit down and, chat. Nasser, and then Omer and Rachel.
Thanks for the paper. It was just like tremendous. I had one sort of stoner observation and then like a question. The observation was Joseph Gion has an excellent paper on Ghostbusters and the Marshmallow Man being a kind of allegorization of boom and busts.
Oh.
But I also realized that listening to this paper, the Marshmallow Man is a kind of Cupid figure. So that gave it world historical depth, that movie. So thank you for that. But the question is about trust. Like I was trying to, in response to Rafi's question, you said that you sort of suggested that this is a way in which people sort of encounter this crazy idea that you would trust in something, and then there's a dismay about it. But it also sounds like the Cupid figure or this entire kind of discourse, it's about trust, but it also has an insight about we'll be seduced by this, but we also know that this is like we're getting into some trouble here. So it's not. I guess I'm wondering, is it so simple as I trust this and then later on I realize, oh, that was a mistake? Or is it also simultaneously producing a kind of mass cultural insight about the absurdity of this and our nevertheless like consuming this and like being seduced by it over and over again?
I think this is just that's a really important point. And so part of what I'm trying to get at in the larger book, and I kind of did give it short shrift just now when I was discussing the placing of trust and then realizing it was a mistake. I mean, I think we all know that as human beings, there's a reason why cryptocurrency scammers, who are sort of using these dating apps, why that works. And 18th century epistolary novels were exploring the same phenomenon, is that we're attracted to things that appeal to us imaginatively. And if you can, to the extent that things are mediated by letters and fantasies and the unknown, it's much more titillating and enticing. And I think that this is where the financial system, it kind of exploits that profound human susceptibility to be willing to kind of accept the fact that when we trust in something, we're also we can be suspicious of it at the same time. I feel like in modern life, you can't do anything at all unless you're simultaneously trusting and doubtful. And I feel like that inseparability of those two modes is something that I see all over a lot of the art of this period.
To just sort of throw it in sharp relief, like Rafi on his lap right now taking notes in Leviathan. And the premise of Leviathan is that you give your trust to like the sovereign and it's total. There's none of that simultaneous cynicism there. Whereas it seems like 60 years later, 70 years later, there is very much an awareness of the absurdity of that trust.
I mean, how secure is that trust? I actually don't know. I mean, is that really, is that even deemed trust, or is that faith? You know, I mean, I'm not sure that trust and faith, I mean, is the word used, is it trust that's invoked in relation to?
I don't expect, but there's a kind of promise that like, well, I'll give up my rights and
Yeah.
someone else will take care of the violence.
Right. I still don't know if it's trust. You know, I mean, I think trust, I think it's more just acquiescence, isn't it? That, I mean, that 17th century way of being. You don't have a choice. I mean, I feel like trust is actually a choice-based.
I mean, this is a tangent, but I feel like now, so you're a little flattening Hobbes. The whole point of Hobbes is that the smart readers know that this is a fiction, right? Like other fictions. And that's why by the end of the 17th century, the people who were real hardcore royalists weren't reading Hobbes because it was incredibly disturbing to think about the state as an artifact. And then on the one hand, the trust is kind of absolute in a material sense, and that the sovereign can just come and, you know, do whatever they want to your body. But it's not absolute in a, you know, in a kind of epistemological sense. It's playful and it's, you know, do you know what I mean? It is, and in fact, you know, the famous frontispiece of the Leviathan would fit really well into your talk, because of course it's about this single united entity,
right? Yeah,
being created.
it's a really good point. Yeah, that's a great observation.
We have time for one more question.
Oh no, because I'm so sorry. Can we just?
And then we'll, excuse me?
I'll ask Nina my question.
Yeah, we'll have time afterwards, just to talk casually. Part of this is because I actually have to teach a class.
Oh, yes. Oh, Mer, please.
I'll be very quick. I just wanted to say how much I enjoy, the way that you really incorporate how the classical past and classical mythologies incorporated into this kind of contemporary politics in the 18th century. And I was just, to go back to the Nile, I was really thinking, I wanted to share with you that, I had in mind, the bottom of Trajan's column, where you have the Danube River that's also represented in this reclining male. And there, in that context, what is really fascinating for me is that, the Roman soldiers who are invading Romania, they're basically walking over the Danube. And the Danube, as the river, is kind of, is the local river, is not sort of really defending its country, its place, but it's helping the Romans to get, and it's a kind of a really this incorporation of the Danube as a mythological figure in support of Roman colonialism, which is kind of really quite nice. And so you beautifully illustrated to us sort of really that those Roman soldiers are kind of really replaced by the Cupids, and it really kind of a really different reading. And I was just really trying to relate this. I don't know if you want to take this as a question, but I was going to try to relate this how a kind of a classical iconographic image and the story, like the river, the Nile or the Danube, is brought in the 18th century as a way of legitimizing the colonial act in this kind of giving this depth of history, the deep past is kind of visualized to us, just like the Romans are kind of really visualizing the Danube to kind of really sort of narrate a kind of their favorable story. And Danny was mentioning about this sort of construction of whiteness, construction of race through the sculpture. And I'm wondering if you have any comments about this particular moment. I mean, that's kind of construction of whiteness through the classical sculpture is well known and understood by us now. But what is maybe I was thinking about sort of the significance of this moment, particularly end of 17th century, early 18th century, in establishing that, right, through this and kind of through this way, through the sort of incorporation of the Nile as an allegory, and specifically with this story.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad that you came because I was hoping that you would kind of speak from the perspective of somebody who knows a lot more about the origins of this motif than I ever will. I mean, I know I have to. I'll try to answer very quickly, and then maybe we can speak later. But I mean, I think that this whole idea of the constructing of whiteness and racial categories, I think I would say that even though it's underway at this moment, I don't think that the kind of stabilizing of these categories is something that is like a fait accompli. And I think that what strikes me, and I want to know more about how the Romans understood the people they were colonizing. But from this perspective, I mean, I can say that I really, from what I've read, I don't think that the French relationship to the people in these colonies was necessarily as kind of master slave, or power and colonized as we might, as would later become the case. I mean, the very fact that you had, and this is a very timeless tale of like people romanticizing the new world and wanting to kind of renew themselves and sort of start over again in a more, in like literally in a state of nature. But I mean, I think all of this has a racial politics that is more strange and unstable than maybe we would expect.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.